At 11:23 p.m. on December 15, King Charles signed a constitutional document that had been discussed behind closed doors for 8 months. By the time dawn arrived, the line of succession no longer looked the same as it had the day before. The decision was not driven by scandal or political upheaval, but by a medical reality the palace could no longer set aside. The signing occurred in the blue drawing room at Clarence House, a room Charles favoured for its warmth and intimacy. Outside, London lay asleep beneath a biting December chill that seeped into stone and pavement alike. Inside, a small circle of witnesses stood almost motionless as the king lifted his pen and began the deliberate act of reshaping constitutional history. When he signed, the motion was steady and intentional. Charles appeared in the familiar handwriting that had marked countless royal documents over decades, though none carried the same weight as this one. Prince William stood beside him, pen in hand, his expression carefully composed. Still, the tension was evident in his posture and the rigidity of his shoulders. Behind them, Princess Anne, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord Chamberlain, and a senior Privy Council representative formed a quiet semicircle. No words were exchanged. The only sounds were the faint scrape of ink on paper and the soft ticking of a mantel clock once owned by Queen Elizabeth. Once both signatures were complete, the Lord Chamberlain stepped forward to apply the official seal. The document was then secured in a leather portfolio and dispatched immediately to the Constitutional Affairs Office, where it would be formally registered, copied, and distributed to the relevant government and Commonwealth authorities. There was no celebration and no applause. Instead, the Archbishop offered a brief, subdued blessing, spoken with the awareness that he was witnessing a rare and solemn moment. It marked a king preparing for the possibility of his own incapacity and a son accepting responsibilities he had hoped would remain hypothetical. By the time the witnesses departed shortly after midnight, the constitutional process was already underway. Encrypted messages were being sent to prime ministers across the Commonwealth, while legal advisers in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and numerous other realms were roused to review the changes and prepare coordinated public statements for the morning. In London itself, the night passed quietly. Most of the country slept, unaware that anything of consequence had taken place. There were no leaks and no dramatic headlines, only the careful, methodical work of an institution adjusting itself to realities it wished to avoid but could no longer ignore. When December 16 dawned, the public would learn that the succession had shifted, not through abdication or death, but through a more restrained and contemporary approach. It was an acknowledgement that monarchy, like any human institution, must adapt to vulnerability and medical truth. The roots of that December decision lay months earlier, in the autumn of 2025, when a series of medical appointments began to reveal concerns the king could no longer dismiss as fleeting discomforts. In late September, fatigue set in and refused to ease. Charles, long known for his relentless schedule and endurance, found himself taking afternoon rests that grew longer than planned. Engagements that once invigorated him now left him depleted. His personal physician, Sir Hugh Dubone, who had served the royal family for over 20 years, recognized the pattern and discreetly ordered comprehensive tests. The results, delivered in early October, were not alarming in the immediate sense, but they were troubling. Tests showed cardiac strain consistent with age and decades of sustained pressure. Early signs of vascular fatigue appeared as well, manageable for now, but progressive over time. More concerning was the effect prolonged stress was having on Charles's ability to sustain high-level decision-making. This was not dementia or classic cognitive decline, but a gradual reduction in mental stamina that made long, complex working days increasingly taxing. Sir Hugh conveyed the findings plainly during a private meeting at Birk Hall in mid-October. He explained that His Majesty could continue performing his duties effectively for some time, possibly years, but emphasized the importance of limiting strain and preparing for the possibility that the demands of the role might eventually exceed what could be managed safely. After that conversation, Charles sat in silence, gazing across the Scottish landscape he cherished. He had waited a lifetime to become king, ascending the throne at an age when many men had already stepped away from public life. Now, scarcely 3 years into his reign, he was being confronted with the likelihood that his time might be shorter than he had imagined. The constitutional dilemma was impossible to avoid. Britain's monarchy still relied on laws written for an era when modern medicine could not extend life or manage chronic illness as it does today. The regency provisions established after the 1936 abdication crisis assumed a stark choice: a monarch was either fully capable or entirely incapacitated. There was no allowance for partial capacity, no mechanism for a gradual handover, and no framework for a controlled transition. Charles immediately grasped the consequences. If his health were to decline further, the existing system would require a formal declaration of incapacity, a process that would be public, disruptive, and potentially destabilizing. Parliamentary involvement would be unavoidable. The councillors of state arrangement, intended only for brief absences, offered no solution for long-term health challenges. Even worse, the absence of a clear plan meant that any transition to William during a medical crisis would be improvised rather than orderly. For a man who had spent his entire life preparing for the crown, the thought of leaving his son to inherit it under such circumstances was something he could not accept. Charles chose to raise the matter privately with William during a walk at Sandringham in late October. It was a hard conversation, not because William resisted it, but because both men immediately grasped what it truly meant. For Charles, it was an admission of vulnerability and mortality. For William, it was an invitation to shoulder a responsibility he had hoped would remain distant for many years. William's immediate reaction was to reject the premise. He insisted that his father was healthy, managing well, and that the discussion felt premature. Charles responded calmly but firmly. He acknowledged that he was coping for now, but explained that Sir Hugh had warned his capacity was likely to diminish gradually. When that happened, Charles said, the monarchy could not afford to improvise constitutional decisions in the middle of a crisis. Planning had to be done early, deliberately, and with care. William had no answer. He continued walking beside his father without speaking, both of them weighed down by the inevitability of what lay ahead. When Princess Anne was brought into the discussions in early November, her response was predictably practical. She reminded Charles that this was precisely the purpose of succession planning. He was not stepping aside, she argued, but safeguarding continuity. There was no disgrace in that. Yet Charles could not entirely escape a sense of shame, no matter how carefully he concealed it. He had waited a lifetime to become king, and now he was constructing pathways that might ease him away from the very role he had trained for since childhood. Emotionally, it felt like failure, even though he understood intellectually that it was an act of prudence. The medical situation that forced this reckoning was not dramatic. Charles was not dying, nor was he facing a terminal diagnosis. He was simply growing older in a position that demanded more stamina than an aging body could reliably sustain. It was an ordinary human challenge unfolding under extraordinary public scrutiny. Throughout October and into November, Charles authorized his legal advisors to begin developing a solution. The goal was a constitutional mechanism that would allow for an orderly transition, one that enabled William to assume royal responsibilities gradually if required by Charles's health, without the spectacle of abdication or the disruption of sudden incapacity. By mid-November, the draft was complete, leaving Charles with the most difficult step of all, asking his son to read it. The urgency for reform stemmed from outdated succession law. The legal framework governing the British monarchy had remained largely unchanged since 1936, when Edward VII's abdication forced Parliament to clarify succession rules for the first time. That legislation, shaped by crisis, aimed to prevent a repeat of Edward's abdication by requiring parliamentary approval and ensuring absolute clarity in the line of succession. What lawmakers in 1936 could not have foreseen was the transformation of medical science over the next 9 decades. At the time, illnesses either incapacitated leaders quickly or ended their lives. There was no prolonged decline sustained by modern medicine. Capacity was treated as an all-or-nothing condition. By 2025, that assumption had become dangerously obsolete. Charles and his legal advisors understood that waiting for a crisis to expose these shortcomings would place the monarchy at unacceptable risk. The dilemma was straightforward. If Charles became unable to fully perform his duties, the law offered only 2 paths. He could abdicate, a permanent and highly public process requiring parliamentary approval and the surrender of the crown. Alternatively, he could be declared incapacitated, an equally public procedure involving medical evaluations, Privy Council action, and the formal appointment of a regent. Neither option addressed the most likely scenario predicted by Charles's doctors, a gradual reduction in capacity, where some responsibilities remained manageable while others became too demanding. Existing law offered no way for a monarch to step back selectively, transferring certain constitutional duties while retaining others. There was certainly no provision for doing so discreetly and with dignity. Charles had witnessed his mother confront similar challenges. Queen Elizabeth, committed to serving until her death, had slowly scaled back her schedule and delegated more responsibilities to Charles. However, those arrangements were informal, grounded in tradition rather than legal authority. When Elizabeth died, the transition was immediate, relying on years of behind-the-scenes preparation. Charles did not want his own succession to hinge on sudden death or public emergency. He wanted a framework that reflected reality, allowed for controlled change, and shielded both the institution and his son from unnecessary strain. Questions from Commonwealth realms underscored the problem. These inquiries were not confrontational but practical, aimed at understanding how constitutional systems would function if Britain's monarch faced prolonged health challenges. The palace's inability to offer clear answers highlighted the structural weakness. Princess Anne pressed hardest for swift action. During a November meeting at Windsor, she told Charles bluntly that governance could not rely on optimism. Medical realities had changed, she said, and the constitution needed to change with them. The legal team faced immense complexity. Any solution had to apply across 15 Commonwealth realms, each with distinct constitutional arrangements. The language needed to be precise yet adaptable. Most importantly, it had to avoid signaling weakness or suggesting that Charles was preparing to abdicate. The proposed mechanism addressed these concerns carefully. It did not require a declaration of incapacity. Instead, it allowed the monarch to voluntarily transfer specific constitutional powers to the heir when medical advice indicated that doing so would best serve stability. The choice remained entirely with the monarch and was grounded in medical assessment rather than political pressure. The transfer could also be incremental. William might take on responsibilities such as hosting state visits or overseeing investments, while Charles retained duties like weekly audiences with the Prime Minister or approving key documents. This acknowledged that capacity exists on a spectrum. Crucially, the arrangement was reversible. If Charles's condition stabilized or improved, powers could be restored. This was not abdication by another name, but an attempt to introduce flexibility into a rigid constitutional system. The Commonwealth realms consulted discreetly during the drafting process, responded with cautious approval. Many recognized that their own succession laws required similar modernization. Canada's constitutional advisors were especially influential, drawing on their experience managing leadership transitions affected by health issues. By early December, the document was finalized. It rested on Charles's desk at Clarence House, awaiting the moment he would present it to the person most affected, Prince William, his son and heir, the man who would carry the weight of this new arrangement. It was a document William did not want to read. On December 12, an envelope arrived at Kensington Palace, delivered by royal courier under the highest security classification. William's private secretary brought it to him during a late afternoon meeting, apologizing as he interrupted. William immediately understood this was not routine. From His Majesty, the secretary said quietly. For your eyes only. To be read in private. William dismissed the meeting and retreated to his study, alone, as winter darkness gathered outside the windows. The envelope before him was thick, sealed with the king's personal insignia. Inside, he found two items, a formal legal document, the draft of the Transitional Regency Protocol, and a personal letter from his father, handwritten on Clarence House stationery. He read the letter first. My dearest William, it began in Charles's distinctive sloping script. What follows is difficult to write and will likely be difficult to read, but it is necessary, and I believe you will understand why. The letter explained, more personally than any medical report ever could, what Charles had been experiencing, the fatigue, the medical consultations, and the growing awareness that his ability to serve as king might be limited by time and health in ways he had never anticipated. Charles wrote with a vulnerability William had rarely seen, acknowledging fears and frustrations his father would never express publicly. I do not know how much time I have to serve effectively, Charles had written. It may be many years. It may be fewer than I hope. But I cannot in good conscience leave these questions unanswered until crisis forces answers upon us both. The letter ended with a request: read the document. Consider what it asks of you, and when you are ready, let us discuss it together. This is not something I can decide alone. William set the letter aside and turned to the legal document. The language was dense, filled with constitutional terminology and legal provisions, yet its core meaning was clear. Should Charles's health decline to the point that medical advice suggested a partial transfer of duties, this protocol would allow William to assume them without the drama of abdication or formal incapacity proceedings. He read it twice, then set it down, staring at nothing in particular. His first reaction was not readiness or duty, it was refusal. He did not want this responsibility, not now, not like this. His father had waited his entire life to be king. William had expected the same. The thought of assuming royal powers while his father still lived, still wore the crown, felt wrong in ways he could not articulate. An hour later, Catherine found him still sitting in the darkened study. She turned on a lamp and sat beside him in silence, waiting for him to speak. "He wants me to share the crown," William finally said. "While he is still alive, while he can still function." Catherine glanced at the documents on his desk. "Is he ill?" "Not acutely, but it is declining gradually, and he wants to manage the transition while he can still make clear decisions about it." Catherine considered this. "That seems wise." William shook his head. "It seems like I'm waiting for him to weaken so I can take his place." "That's not what this is," Catherine said gently. "This is your father trying to protect you from having the transition forced by crisis. He is giving you time to prepare. That is a gift, not a burden." "It feels like both," William admitted. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, London's evening traffic hummed distantly. Inside, the weight of succession pressed down on them with a force they had prepared for intellectually but not emotionally. Catherine spoke again, quietly but firmly. "Your father spent 70 years waiting, watching his mother work until she died in office. He knows what that cost her, and he knows what it would cost you if he did the same. This is not weakness, William. This is him loving you enough to spare you the worst of what he endured." William looked at her, seeing the strength that had made her a steady partner through everything the royal role had demanded. "You think I should agree to this?" he asked. "I think you should talk to him," Catherine replied. "And I think you should understand that refusing this does not protect him. It only makes the inevitable harder when it comes." William knew she was right. But knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally were two different things. He requested a meeting with his father for December 14th. The 2 days that followed were spent consulting privately with constitutional experts, ensuring he fully understood the document and could prepare for a conversation he had never imagined having. The meeting took place at Clarence's house on a cold evening scented with the approaching snow. Charles had cleared his calendar for 2 hours. They sat in the same blue drawing room where the signing would eventually take place, though neither knew that yet. William began carefully. "I have read the document and your letter, and I understand why you believe this is necessary." Charles waited, sensing the hesitation in his son's voice. "But I do not want to appear eager for this," William continued. "I do not want people to think I am pushing you aside." Charles leaned forward, gentle but serious. "You have never been eager for my position, William. You have carried your role with reluctance and duty in equal measure. No one who knows you could possibly believe you are pushing me aside." "Then what will they believe?" William asked. "That you are too weak to continue? That the crown is crumbling?" Charles shook his head. "They will believe because we will tell them clearly that we are modernizing how succession functions, that we are planning responsibly for realities that medical science has made newly relevant. There is no shame in that." William looked down at his hands. "This means you are preparing to step back." "This means," Charles corrected gently, "that I am preparing for the possibility that I may need to step back. If that time never comes, the protocol sits unused. But if it does, we will be ready, and you will not be forced to assume everything at once during a crisis." Their conversation continued for over an hour, moving through practical details and emotional undercurrents. Charles explained the medical realities he faced. William expressed his fears about assuming power prematurely. Gradually, through the kind of honest conversation fathers and sons rarely manage, they reached understanding. By the time William left Clarence's house that evening, he had not yet agreed to sign but had committed to considering it seriously. And Charles, reading his son's face, understood that this consideration would lead to acceptance, not because William wanted it, but because he understood, as Charles did, that the crown required it. 2 days later, on the evening of December 15th, William returned to Clarence's house with Catherine. He had made his decision, and though it pained him, though it felt like stepping into his father's shadow before his father had fully stepped aside, he knew it was his duty. The signing would take place that night, and by morning, the line of succession would function differently than it had for nearly 90 years. The silent witnesses and what they saw. By 10:45 p.m. on December 15th, the blue drawing room at Clarence's house had been meticulously prepared for a ceremony that would leave an indelible mark on those present, though few outside the room would fully grasp its significance. The furniture had been arranged to balance formality with intimacy. At the center stood a mahogany desk, borrowed from the palace archive and historically used for treaty signings. 2 chairs were positioned before it, one for Charles and one for William. Behind them, space was set aside for witnesses to stand at a respectful distance, close enough to observe, yet far enough to preserve the solemnity of the moment. Princess Anne arrived first, punctual as ever, dressed in a dark suit that reflected the gravity of the occasion without suggesting mourning. She greeted Charles with a brief kiss on the cheek and a searching look that silently asked whether he was certain about this course of action. His slight nod confirmed he was. Moments later, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, arrived, his presence adding spiritual weight to what was, at its core, a constitutional act. Fully briefed over the previous days, he understood that although his role was ceremonial, his witness would be recorded in history. The Church of England had long been intertwined with succession matters since Henry VIII, and this quiet moment marked yet another evolution in that enduring relationship. Next, the Lord Chamberlain, Baron Parker, entered carrying the official seals required to validate the document once signed. As the senior officer of the royal household, he ensured that all procedural requirements were followed with precision. Though he moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to countless state occasions, even he seemed affected by the unique nature of this ceremony. The final witness, Dame Margaret Whitmore, represented the Privy Council. Her responsibility was to ensure the signing complied with constitutional rules and that the council would be formally notified to ratify the changes at their next meeting. A veteran of constitutional law for over 30 years, she had never witnessed anything like this, a king voluntarily limiting his own power in preparation for possible future incapacity. Prince William arrived at 10:58 p.m., accompanied by Catherine, who would not witness the signing but whose presence William had quietly requested. She remained in an adjacent room, close enough for William to know she was there, yet respecting that only those with formal constitutional roles could participate in the signing. Charles and William shared a quiet moment together, father and son, king and heir, carrying the weight of decades of shared history. Then Charles gestured toward the chairs, and both men sat at a. The document lay on the desk between them, illuminated by 2 standing lamps casting a warm glow. The Lord Chamberlain had placed 2 fountain pens beside it, traditional instruments for state documents, both engraved with the royal cipher. The Archbishop stepped forward, his voice calm and clear. "Let us begin with a moment of prayer." The brief blessing invoked wisdom, strength, and divine guidance for both men as they undertook this solemn act. Though traditional, drawn from centuries of church practice, the words felt deeply relevant in a modern context where faith and constitutional duty intersected in unexpected ways. After the prayer, the Lord Chamberlain formally presented the document, reading its title aloud, the Transitional Regency Protocol, establishing revised procedures for transferring royal powers in cases of the sovereign's partial or progressive incapacity. The language was deliberately bureaucratic, but everyone in the room understood its weight, Charles acknowledging his own fragility, and William accepting a responsibility he had hoped to face much later. Charles picked up his pen first. He read through the document one last time, his reading glasses catching the lamplight, his expression composed yet tinged with emotion. When he began to sign, the room collectively held its breath. Charles R. The signature was firm, each letter deliberate. The final flourish on the R was decisive, as it had been on countless documents before, but this one was different. It fundamentally changed the relationship between king and heir. Charles set down his pen and looked at William, their shared expression blending apology, hope, sorrow, and pragmatism. William understood that his father was not stepping aside, he was providing him the tools to act gracefully if needed. It was, in its own way, an act of love. William picked up his pen, steady despite the gravity of the moment. He read the sections outlining his responsibilities, the powers he would assume if the protocol were activated, and the duties he would perform on his father's behalf. Then he signed, William. He did not use a regal signature, for this was not about claiming the throne, it was about sharing its burden. Once both signatures were complete, the Lord Chamberlain applied the official seal, pressing it firmly into the prepared red wax. The sound echoed in the quiet room, final and irrevocable. Dame Margaret countersigned as witness, followed by the Archbishop and Princess Anne. Each signature added gravity, transforming the document from theory into constitutional reality. Anne allowed herself a rare display of emotion, briefly placing her hand on Charles's shoulder, a gesture noted by several witnesses. Charles covered her hand with his own, a moment of sibling solidarity that reflected decades of shared duty and mutual respect. The Archbishop offered a final blessing over Charles and William. May God grant you both strength for the days ahead, wisdom in the exercise of your duties, and peace in the knowledge that you serve a purpose greater than yourselves. When the ceremony concluded at 11:27 p.m., there was no applause or formal congratulations. The Lord Chamberlain collected the now sealed and witnessed documents, placing them in the leather portfolio that would carry them to the Constitutional Affairs Office for official registration. The witnesses departed quietly, aware that what they had witnessed would be discussed for years, analyzed by historians, and remembered as a turning point in the modern management of royal succession. But in that moment, as they left Clarence House and returned to London's sleeping streets, they carried only a sense of having witnessed something both profoundly sad and remarkably wise. Charles and William remained in the blue drawing room after everyone else had gone. Catherine rejoined them, moving to William's side without a word. Queen Camilla, who had waited in her private sitting room during the signing, entered quietly and stood beside Charles. For several minutes, the four of them simply existed together in the aftermath of what had been done. No one felt the need to speak. The document was signed. The future was now structured differently than it had been an hour earlier, and all of them, in their different ways, were processing what that meant. Finally, Charles broke the silence. "Thank you," he said simply, looking at William. William nodded. It was the right thing to do. But it was not an easy thing, Catherine added quietly. Charles smiled faintly. The right things rarely are. They parted shortly after midnight, Charles and Camilla returning to their private apartments, William and Catherine departing for Kensington Palace. The lights in Clarence House dimmed and London settled into the few remaining hours before dawn would bring the news to a world that did not yet know the monarchy had fundamentally changed. What changed and what it means for the crown became clear when the Buckingham Palace press office released the statement at precisely 7 a.m. on December 16, time to reach British morning broadcasts while accommodating time zones across the Commonwealth. The language was careful, measured, designed to inform without alarming. Within minutes, the statement was being analysed by constitutional experts across Britain. The initial reaction was not alarm, but curiosity. Regency protocols had not been significantly updated since the mid-20th century. That Charles had chosen to modernise them seemed on its face responsible rather than concerning. But as journalists and legal scholars began parsing the details released in accompanying briefing documents, the fuller picture emerged. This was not simply administrative housekeeping. This was a fundamental restructuring of how succession could function, creating flexibility where rigidity had previously existed. The key change, explained in a detailed annex prepared for Parliament and Commonwealth legislatures, centred on the concept of transitional regency. Unlike traditional regency, which required formal declarations of complete incapacity, this new protocol allowed for voluntary partial transfer of powers based on medical advice rather than political determination. Practically, this meant that if Charles's doctors advised that certain royal duties were becoming too demanding for his health, William could assume those specific duties without Charles abdicating or being declared fully incapacitated. The king would retain his title, his position, and those constitutional functions he remained capable of performing. But the burden of the role would be distributed based on medical reality rather than legal fiction. The public reaction, measured through social media and snap polling conducted throughout the morning, was overwhelmingly positive. 79% of Britons surveyed expressed approval for the changes, with many noting that it seemed wise for Charles to plan proactively rather than wait for a crisis. Only 11% expressed concern, primarily focused on whether the changes suggested Charles's health was worse than publicly known. The palace moved quickly to address that concern. A supplementary statement released at 10 a.m. clarified that His Majesty remains in good health and fully capable of fulfilling his duties. This protocol has been enacted as a matter of responsible planning, not in response to immediate medical necessity. Across the Commonwealth, reactions varied slightly, but remained generally supportive. Canada's Prime Minister issued a statement praising the King's foresight and confirming that Canadian constitutional arrangements would be updated to reflect the new protocol. Australia's response was more measured, with Republican voices using the moment to argue for severing ties with the monarchy entirely. But even there, polling showed majority support for the King's decision. New Zealand's Prime Minister, who had privately requested clarity on exactly these issues months earlier, expressed relief that the protocol now existed. "This provides the certainty that our constitutional arrangements require," she said in a brief address to Parliament. American media coverage was characteristically confused. Several major outlets struggled to explain what regency meant in a monarchical context, with some initially reporting incorrectly that Charles had abdicated. By midday, corrections had been issued and more nuanced analysis had emerged, but the coverage revealed how little Americans understood about the constitutional mechanics of monarchy. What most coverage missed, both in Britain and internationally, was the deeper significance of what Charles had done. He had not simply updated legal procedures. He had confronted the fundamental tension at the heart of modern monarchy, the conflict between the symbolic importance of a lifetime sovereign and the practical reality that human bodies and minds decline in ways that medicine can now extend but not prevent. For centuries, monarchs had died in office because they had no choice. Modern medicine had created choice, but constitutional law had not caught up. Charles's protocol was an attempt to bridge that gap, to create a mechanism for managed transition that honored both the institution's need for continuity and the individual's need for dignity. William, briefed on the morning's coverage at Kensington Palace, felt a complex mixture of relief and apprehension. The public had received the news calmly, which was good. But he also understood that the protocol's existence would now color every future speculation about Charles's health. Any minor illness, any reduced schedule, would trigger questions about whether the transitional regency was being activated. Catherine, reading through the press summaries beside him, spoke the concern aloud. "Every time he cancels an engagement now, people will wonder if this is the beginning." William nodded grimly. "That is the price of transparency. We have acknowledged that his capacity may decline. Now every sign of that decline will be magnified." But the alternative, Catherine countered, was waiting until the crisis forced the transition. "This way, at least there is a plan." Later that morning, William attended a working breakfast meeting with Charles, and senior constitutional advisors. The atmosphere was businesslike, focused on implementation details and Commonwealth coordination. But beneath the procedural discussions, a new dynamic was evident. Charles and William were no longer simply king and heir. They were now constitutional partners, linked by a document that acknowledged the transfer of power between them was no longer a distant theoretical possibility, but a practical reality that could unfold at any time. Princess Anne, observing the subtle shift in how her brother and nephew interacted, allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. For years, she had pushed for exactly this kind of forward planning, and watching it unfold validated her belief that the monarchy survived not through rigid adherence to tradition, but through thoughtful adaptation. By evening, as the news cycle moved on to other stories, the palace had successfully managed the transition of public understanding. The Transitional Regency Protocol was now part of Britain's constitutional framework, accepted by Parliament, coordinated across the Commonwealth, and broadly supported by the public. But inside Kensington Palace, as William sat in his study reviewing documents for the following day's engagements, the weight of what had changed settled over him more fully. The crown he would one day wear had moved closer, not through his father's death, but through his father's wisdom in planning for incapacity. It was not the inheritance he had imagined, but perhaps, he thought, it was the inheritance modern monarchy required. Not dramatic abdication or sudden succession, but measured transition, planned with care and executed with dignity. Catherine found him there an hour later, staring out at the December darkness. "You are thinking too much," she said gently. William smiled faintly. "Occupational hazard." She moved beside him, their shoulders touching in the comfortable silence of a partnership that had weathered everything royal life had demanded. "Your father gave you time," she said. "Time to prepare. Time to grow into what is coming. That is more than most heirs receive." William knew she was right. Charles, who had waited 70 years, had given his son something he himself had never received, a gradual path to the crown rather than a sudden shock, planning instead of crisis, partnership instead of abrupt replacement. It was, William realized, perhaps the greatest gift his father could have given him, not the crown itself, which would come eventually regardless, but the framework to assume it without destroying either himself or the institution in the process. Outside, London continued its evening rhythms, unaware that in a quiet study at Kensington Palace, the future king was processing a change that would define how succession functioned for generations to come. The document signed at 11:23 p.m. on December 15 had altered more than legal procedures. It had altered the relationship between father and son, between king and heir, between present and future. And though the public would never fully grasp the emotional weight of that alteration, those who had witnessed it, those who had signed it, and those who would live with its implications understood. The crown had not weakened. It had adapted. And in that adaptation lay its continued survival.